So hello and welcome everybody. My name is Irina Paert. I am an associate professor at the University of Tartu, Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies. And this is the seminar from the series Understanding Соборность that have been running already for more than a year. And today we are going to speak about the Russian student Christian movement. And today is an unusual session because we have several speakers or discussants who will talk about Russian student Christian movement in the context of our topic, conciliarity, соборность, as well as in kind of broader sense, especially because this year it's the 100th anniversary of this movement. And I will pass the floor now to Andrey Shishkov, who is going to introduce our speakers and say a few words about...
Thank you, Irina. 100 years ago, in early October of 1923, the first founding Congress of different Russian Christian youth organizations in Europe was held in Prešerov, then Czechoslovakia. Today it is a Czech Republic. The convention was sponsored by such major ecumenical organizations as Young Men's Christian Association and the World Student Christian Federation. Here was laid the groundwork for a renewed movement of Orthodox youth, which was called the Russian Student Christian Movement. At the Congress were such prominent figures of the Russian Orthodox immigration as Father Sergei Bulgakov, Anton Kartashov, Nikolai Afanasyev, and others. The Russian Student Christian Movement as an organization didn't emerge in 1923, but much earlier. In 1899, John Mott, General Secretary of the World Student Christian Federation and President of Young Men's Christian Association, one of the major ecumenical figures of the era, came to the Russian Empire, especially to Finland. And here he gave lectures at universities and met some prominent figures. And his success and example led to the emergence of the Russian branch of the Young Men's Christian Association, the Mayak movement, established in St. Petersburg, and similar circles arose in Orthodox bias around Sergei Bulgakov and Mikhail Novoselov. And in 1913, the Russian Christian student movement was accepted into the World Student Christian Federation. In the immigration, many educational and scholarly institutions sprang up around the movement, the most vivid of which the St. Serge Institute of Theology in Paris, which creation was decided at the Second Congress of the movement in 1925 in Argenone, France. And today we will talk about the Russian Student Christian movement as a unique case of conciliarity from below. We will discuss the influence on it of the ideas of the Moscow Council of 1917. We will talk about the liturgical revival, about the ecumenism and Orthodox confessionalism, and we will build bridges to modernity, to nowadays, and discuss how this movement tried to reassemble the idea of community or община. Our speakers today, Matthew Lee Miller is professor of history at University of Northwestern in St. Paul, Minnesota, United States. Ulyana Gutner, independent scholar of Russian church history, and Cyrille Sollogoub, current president of the Russian Student Christian Movement. Barbara Martin from the University of Basel, and Irina Paert, the leader of our project and associate professor of the University of Tartu. Today we have some general questions and topics to discussion, and we will start with the ecumenical aspects of the movement. particularly the close links with Young Men's Christian Associations and World Student Christian Federation. And the first speaker will be Matthew Lee Miller, and please, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you today. The American YMCA participated in the work of two Russian student Christian movements, which were similar in purpose, but quite different in approach. In the early 1900s, the RSCM emerged as a unique interconfessional community, which connected men and women from many universities and institutes within the Russian Empire. The American Young Men's Christian Association served as a catalyst in this process and introduced a variety of their optimistic ideas and pragmatic methods into the movement. Over time, the movement adopted a more exclusive Orthodox identity while also adapting a number of the Y's approaches, such as small, intense discussion groups and annual leadership conferences. After the revolutions of 1917, the movement reorganized in several European university cities as many Russian young people began new lives in emigration. However, a wing continued to function within Soviet Russia until its extermination during the 1930s. The activity of the Russian student Christian movement led to a vital transformation of Orthodox life for many participants, as well as a stimulus for remarkable intellectual and cultural achievements within the Russian emigre world. The movement also played a major role in developing a new generation of leadership for the Russian Orthodox Church, which valued active lay participation, attention to the special needs of young people, group discussion of the scriptures, and openness to other Christian confessions. In this way, the movement and the American YMCA, primarily a Protestant organization, contributed to the expansion and enrichment of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. As Baron Pavel Nikolai, a Lutheran nobleman with an estate in Finland and a home in St. Petersburg, developed relationships with Russian university students during the 1890s, he sensed a deep moral and spiritual need among them. Nikolai believed that even those from religious families did not possess a vital personal faith in God. Therefore, he formed the student movement to be an evangelistic outreach. John R. Mott, the leader of the international work of the American YMCA, was an optimist, but his view of the spiritual condition of Russian students was also far from positive. The two primary leaders of the pre-revolutionary Russian student Christian movement were Nikolai and Mott. They met in 1899 at a YMCA meeting in Helsinki. Mott requested that Nikolai accompany him to St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Dorpat, that is Tartu, in order to meet students and investigate the possibility of establishing a ministry among university men. The movement spread to the universities of Moscow in 1907 and Kiev in 1910. Many interested men and women began to attend Bible study circles arranged by the movement. After 15 years of growth, the movement declined quickly after the onset of the First World War and the death of Nikolai. The movement's limited operation continued under the direction of Vladimir Marcinkovsky. The American YMCA first sent staff members, called secretaries, for student work to Russia in 1908. From this year until 1914, the American YMCA sponsored 4 student secretaries for work in St. Petersburg and Kiev. Many students welcomed these earnest young Americans, but others were far from enthusiastic. However, it is clear that the Russian members held on to several suggestions of the Americans and utilized their ideas as they pressed forward after the secretary's departures. From the beginning, the movement attracted the participation of many Orthodox students, but the movement did not receive any support from the hierarchy. This led to limitations on its activity, but broadened the appeal of the movement to those who were open spiritually but closed to the formal church. The leaders of the post-revolution movement in Europe planned their efforts to meet social and religious needs and help preserve the culture of Russian Orthodoxy during these critical years. The movement was formed for the careful study of the Christian faith and for active and organized involvement in the life of the church. The movement worked out its direction at its conferences from 1923 until 1930. The first general conference, as we discussed, was held in 1923, and the movement decided it would function with an Orthodox confessional program, not with an interconfessional approach as it had in Russia. The formal mission statement was broad but very specific. Quote, the Russian student Christian movement abroad has as its fundamental purpose the association of believing youth for the service of the Orthodox Church and bringing unbelievers to faith in Christ. It seeks to aid its members to work out a Christian view of life and sets itself the task of preparing defenders of the church and faith, able to conduct struggle with contemporary atheism and materialism, end of quote. The founding of the second movement was a joint venture between Russian university men and women and the American YMCA. In the early 1920s, significant groups of Russians began to meet at universities in 5 European cities. The Russian students initiated the groups in Belgrade, Sofia, and Paris, while American Y secretaries established the meetings in Berlin and Prague. These were Amos Ebersol, Ralph Hollinger, and Donald Lowry, as well as Gustav Kuhlmann from Switzerland. They attempted to understand the mindset and priorities of Russian professors and students as they advised and encouraged them. At the meetings, learners and professors such as the influential Sergei Bulgakov, George Florovsky, Nikolai Berdyaev, Anton Kartashov, and several others met for study and discussion of the Bible, the writings of the Church Fathers, and Russian philosophy. Nikolai Zernov was an early leader of the student movement in Belgrade. Vasily Zenkovsky began his participation in this circle soon after its formation in 1921. At that time, he was teaching psychology at the university. Zenkovsky became one of the most active members of this circle and later of the entire movement. Until 1923, Zernov and the circle in Belgrade were not aware of the YMCA's interaction with Orthodox students in Prague and Paris. Therefore, they were very surprised to receive a telegram from Ralph Hollinger, the Y staff member who wanted to meet with this Belgrade circle. This meeting with Hollinger led to a very skeptical Zernov and the Belgrade circle to participate in interconfessional student conferences and develop acquaintances beyond the sphere of Orthodoxy. Years later, Zernov described his appreciation for the work of the American YMCA leaders, especially Paul B. Anderson and Gustav Kuhlmann. He wrote, quote, their experience and benevolence were very valuable for the movement. With them, we immediately developed a relationship of full trust and friendship. Although financial assistance from foreigners passed through their hands, they never behaved as a boss. On the contrary, they were attracted to Orthodoxy and Russian culture. They spoke Russian well and identified themselves completely with the movement, end of quote. So what was the relationship between the movement and the Russian Orthodox Church in Europe? Although many Russian emigre clergy supported the movement, several priests adamantly opposed its work. Most favored closer contact with the churches of Europe and America, yet a vocal, conservative, traditionalist minority advocated total separation from non-Orthodox churches. The metropolitan of the first group, Yevlogy, welcomed the activity of the movement and the support of the YMCA. The second group of clergy, led by Metropolitan Antoni Hrapovitsky, met in Yugoslavia in 1926 and issued a condemnation of the Protestant YMCA as anti-Christian and Masonic. This condemnation forbade Orthodox believers from associating with these groups. However, most clergy and believers did not accept this decree. And of course, this was a painful experience, especially for Zernov and Zenkovsky, since Metropolitan Antoni had participated in the Belgrade Circle. In 2003, Nikita Struve, the prominent movement leader, shared about the role played by the YMCA in the history of the movement. And his comments included this point, quote, the first push came from the Protestant West. Is it not time to acknowledge that the good seeds sown from the West can give wonderful sprouts on Eastern Orthodox soil? End of quote. Perhaps the finest compliment on the value of the YMCA's contribution to the movement came from Metropolitan Yevlogy, the spiritual leader of many in the movement. His comments included, quote, we, the movement, utilize the material support of this organization, the American YMCA, which was wealthy and friendly to us, but we remained faithful to our ideology, which lay at the foundation of our association and always emphasized our inner independence, which did not prevent us from maintaining the best relationships with our friends. At the head of the YMCA were leaders of broad views and considerate relationships to our ideology. They supported us, never using philanthropy as a means for propaganda of their doctrine among Russians." End of quote. In conclusion, ecumenical contacts played a significant role in the life of the movement as it developed its Orthodox self-understanding. Conversations and relationships with YMCA staff members served as catalyst for debate among members of the movement. Most members eventually decided that the movement should develop a confessional Orthodox identity with an emphasis on traditional distinctives. However, they also agreed that the movement should maintain friendly ecumenical relationships with Protestant and Catholic Christians. As a result, they avoided two alternatives. First, they decided not to promote an interconfessional Christian identity, which would place less emphasis on Orthodox distinctives. But second, they also decided not to promote a confessional approach which required an end of ecumenical relationships. So how do the YMCA staff members perceive the movement's role within the broader Orthodox Church? Significant evidence demonstrates that the YMCA valued the ability of the movement to challenge Russian students to consider the ongoing reality of the Christian faith during an era of growing secularization. The YMCA also believed that the movement provided an environment which would encourage young Orthodox lay leaders to take on responsibility for the health of their own church. Finally, the YMCA believed that the movement provided an opportunity for young lay Orthodox believers to develop leadership skills in a very supportive environment. Well, thank you for your attention and the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for this overview, great overview of the history of Russian student Christian movement. And the next question is about relaunched movement in 1923 at the meeting of Prosherov, and about the Orthodox liturgy that was regarded as necessary for the members of the movement. We would like to talk about how can we evaluate the Eucharistic aspect of the movement, both in theology and practice. And here I would like to give a floor for Ulyana Gutner. Please, Ulyana, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. First of all, I can say that the liturgy was the spiritual basis of the movement. As we know, daily liturgy was the center of the Prosherov Conference, and on the Prosherov Conference, Father Sergei Bulgakov formulated the main directions of the movement. They were sobornost, liturgicality, and ecumenism. It was very important that liturgy was at the heart of the connection of the movement with Orthodoxy and the Orthodox Church. Also, Father Sergei marked the beginning of the new Eucharist era, the understanding of the liturgy as an assembly and service of the people, based on the experience of common prayer and the communion of the holy mysteries as a phenomenon of sobornost. So, liturgy was at the heart of the sobornost of the movement. Later, Father Sergei Bulgakov said, "Participating in the liturgy, we are directly before the Lord himself. The liturgy is not just a remembrance, it is communion with the Lord itself. The whole gospel story takes place here. We become participants in his secret supper. But as we are united with the Lord, we are also united to one another in the liturgy, just as intimately inseparable as the individual grains of wheat are united in the bread baked. Thus, in the Eucharist, sobornost is manifested and realized as a vertical connection with the Lord, but also as a horizontal connection, a connection with one another. The next point is, after the Psherov conference, daily liturgy was at the center of all conferences of the movement. On the eve of the last day of the conference, there was usually confession, and the next day at the liturgy, most of the conference participants took communion. The common communion became a kind of summary and the spiritual peak of the conference. This experience was very important for the involvement of young people in the Orthodox Church, Otsarkovlenia, which was the main task of the movement. It should be noted that at the first and subsequent conferences of the movement, there were young people who had not confessed or received Holy Communion since childhood, and some participated in these sacraments for the first time in their lives. The matter is, in pre-revolutionary Russia, taking communion once a year was mandatory to confirm one's membership in Orthodoxy and became a formality that many people did not fulfill. It was thought at the time that lay Orthodox believers should receive communion once a year, even though active believers could attend a service every week. This question about the frequency of communion was raised at the Moscow Council, where it was recommended to return to the early Christian practice of communion every Sunday. It is important that the leaders of the movement called on young people to receive communion at least 4 times a year, general communion at conferences and on certain feasts. Interesting moment is that the idea of translating liturgical texts, or at least the scriptures, into Russian has arisen in the movement many times. The need for translation was clearly felt at the conferences, but the liturgy was never translated into Russian. Already in 1970, Nikolai Zernov wrote thoroughly, for 50 years of the existence of the movement has not enriched life of church, nothing new rites of services, nor their best translations, in spite of unique conditions of freedom and creation of a theology school. Zernov pointed out the reason for this was the constant hope of returning home. He wrote, "The usual excuse was, nothing needs to be changed until we return to Russia, only there will all change be lawful." So precious time was lost, opportunities were not used. The last one, what I would like to say is about the development of the liturgical life of the movement. And the first is extra church liturgy, of which Father Sergei Bulgakov spoke. The liturgy is the crown of life, which all the way to the end service is preparation for it and its continuation. The liturgy outside the temple became the theme of life and the spiritual basis of Mother Mary's Koptsova ministry. The second, liturgy, and as the Eucharistic basic, as a Eucharistic basis of life in the church, as the awareness of the liturgy, as the gathering and service of people. No doubt, this principle was directly or indirectly grasped by Alexander Shmeman during his childhood and youth spent in the movement, and subsequently led to the phenomenon of the Eucharistic revival. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ulyana, and this topic will continue. Cyrille Sollogoub, maybe he also will talk us about the legacy of the Moscow Council of 1917 in the movement. The floor is yours, Cyrille.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank you for your invitation and the opportunity which is given to me to meet you and talk with you about the Russian student Christian movement. We can definitely consider that Russian student Christian movement is the legacy of the Moscow Council, and it is clear for me, and I can personally witness that the spirit of this council not only inspired the founding members of the movement a century ago, but has inspired the leaders of this movement throughout this century and continues to do so. The Council of Moscow was indeed a moment of rediscovery of conciliarity, of the role and place of the laity in the life of the Church, which led to an awareness of the responsibility of each lay person, of each baptized person, for the life of the Church. At the Council, the Church re-established its canonical existence and redefined its mode of governance and functioning. The whole ecclesial body, with a sense of common responsibility for the destiny of the Church, took part in this work, which allowed all the components of the Church to regain their full place in the functioning and life of the Church, hierarchs as well as clerks and laity. It is only in this perspective that, perspective of rediscovery, conciliarity, that we must understand the re-establishment of the Patriarchate. By re-establishing primacy, the Council re-established the principle of conciliarity. Primacy and conciliarity being two notions intimately linked and inseparable from each other. The spirit of the Council of Moscow, the renewal of conciliarity, this rediscovery of the awareness of each baptized person's responsibility for the historical destiny of the Church, have had different fates in two different historical contexts: the Soviet Union from the one hand and the Russian diaspora from the other hand. In the Russian diaspora, in emigration, a Church had the experience of total freedom from all political power, something that had not happened since pre-Constantinian times. And the great strength of the movement's founders and leaders lies precisely in the fact that they understood this enormous change and the opportunities it offered. While most of the Russian emigration was moping in nostalgia for the lost regime, the movement's leaders took the measure of the historical changes not only for Orthodoxy, but for the whole of Christianity. They realized that the history of Christianity was entering a new era in which the Church would have to redefine its relationship with the world, which would ask a great deal of responsibility from each of its members. The prophetic voices that sounded during the founding conference of Psherov formulated the challenges of the moment and defined the tasks to be undertaken. Among those prophetic voices, we must quote Father Sergius Bulgakov's one, of course, who was a member and a key person of the council, a man of vision, and one of the inspirers of the nascent movement, the Russian student Christian movement. And I would like to quote some of his words during this sheriff conference. The Constantine era that began in the 4th century came to an end for us in 1917. Before, everything in the church was given and organized by the state so that we could live passively. Now everything is different and we are obliged to create. We are obliged to create. It is essential for us in a conciliar way to look for new forms of life in the church. End of quotations. And Father Sergius concluded his speech by calling every participant of the conference to take on the weight of responsibility and freedom. The movement appeared to Father Sergius to be a privileged place, a privileged space where conciliarity could be manifested. Again, I would like to quote his words. Conciliarity, that is to say, unity in love and humility, on which freedom and responsibility rest and on which the church is built, should be manifested in our movement. What does it mean concretely? Concretely speaking, how could this conciliarity be implemented, and how has it been implemented in the history of the Russian student Christian movement? We can see that all the activities developed throughout its history have a direct consequence with the fact, with this awareness of being responsible for the church. First of all, education, theological, spiritual, cultural education, which is one of the main tasks of the movement, is a direct consequence of this sense of this awareness of responsibility. If we are really responsible for the church, we must be educated in order to be able to bear this responsibility. Hence, the development of different Bible studies, circles, theological seminars, conferences. In the same idea, if we want to serve the renewal of the church, it is quite natural and evident to begin with youth and children. Hence, all the work developed by the movement aimed at youth and children, the camps, the schools, the kindergartens. Third, the work for unity in all levels within the Orthodox Church and with other Christians. Work for unity and mission. If we have the conviction to be part of the one Catholic and Apostolic Church, it is natural to promote unity and mission. Fourth, in the form, you know that the movement has developed throughout its history two privileged and traditional forms of work. First, the circles, and second, the conferences. The circles are directly inherited by the Bible circles, the Bible studies circles developed in Russia before the revolution by the Protestant missionaries. The circles are regular gatherings of a small number of people for a time of prayer, Bible reading, reflections on various themes. And those circles can be considered as real ecclesial cells for learning and even more embodiment of conciliarity. I would like to quote again Father Sergius Bulgakov, for whom the circles are a way of getting to know the truth given in the church through experience, through life, a way of coming closer to the church. He noticed that many young emigrants came to faith through and thanks to these circles, which are a kind of bridge to the church. The circles are not sectarian communities, as used to say Father Sergius, but they are ecclesial cells, ecclesial seeds. Then the conferences where all the people of God meet, lay people as well as hierarchs, where all those people pray together, discuss how to meet and overcome the different challenges that we have to face. In the movement, which is understood as a lay movement, lay people collaborate with hierarchs. Father Sergius used to say, the hierarchs present and active in the movement are not present as persons invested with juridical power, but as charismatic persons invested with a particular grace of service. This means, concluded Father Sergius, that in the movement, the principle of power does not prevail, but the force of love which dissolves the principle of power into the principle of conciliarity. End of quotation. And finally, conciliarity is implemented in the way to function and to take decisions. All the decisions have to be taken in a collegial manner, and the responsibility for the movement is carried by a group of people chosen by all the members. According to Zinkowski, conciliarity must be the living and effective principle of life of the movement. It does not mean, develops Zinkowski, that within the group of people responsible for the movement, the opinion of the majority or the arithmetic average of the different opinions present should be imposed on all, but on the contrary, or rather, the principle consisted in finding a synthesis with which everybody, without exception, could agree. Father Vasily Zinkowski talks about a mystery of conciliarity, which requires a real collective asceticism and presupposes, in Zinkowski's experience, a strong spirit of ecclesial communion, which, to his great regret, was only achieved at rare privileged moments. In conclusion, we can say that the fall of the Tsarist Empire inaugurated a new era in the life of the Church, the so-called post-Constantinian era, and this historical event was concomitant with a genuine renewal of conciliarity and the rediscovery of the place and role of the laity in the life of the Church. It is clear that in this new era in which the Church needs to redefine its mode of presence in the world, the laity, lay people have an important role to play. History has already shown the important place occupied by those lay movements as a place of embodiment, incarnation of conciliarity, as a unique space for the formation of responsible persons for the life of the Church, or even more as a place of renewal of fraternal life in Christ. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Kirill. Thank you for preserving all the spirit of Moscow Council of 1917 in the current movement. About practical and theoretical aspects of conciliarity, will talk Irina Paert. Please.
Kirill made my job much easier because he's already covered many of the aspects. So I think my presentation will just go through many points which he has mentioned. According to the kind of working theory that our team has proposed, and we are working on the handbook or companion to conciliarity. So we understand conciliarity as an ecclesial paradigm shift that is taking place in the 19th century already with Khomyakov and other Slavophiles, but also it is not limited only to the Russian case. So it is ecclesial paradigm happening in other Orthodox contexts in Greece, in the Balkans, and so we see it as a kind of shift from Christological to Trinitarian theology, where the role of the Holy Spirit is emphasized, and it is expressed in the different concepts: Sobornost, Koinonia, Catholicity, and this paradigmal shift is expressing itself in the 20th century, especially in the period after the First World War. So we kind of try to position different movements, including the Russian student Christian movement, within this paradigm shift. So the church is manifested itself in different forms. It could be a local Eucharistic community, it could be a kruzhok, or this kind of conference, where, as Kirill has pointed out, a hierarch, a member of the clergy, is present as somebody who is kind of bearing, Holy Spirit, somebody who is endowed by grace, but not because of his hierarchical position. So it's kind of, you see in this photograph, Bishop Ioan Bulin from Narva Diocese and Pechersky Monastery, and also another priest. I'm not sure, I think it was a Latvian priest and a nun. So they're present among lay people gathering in Kurema and Puhtice Monastery in the 1930s. So this is a very typical photograph from the time. So now let me just go quickly through. Okay, this is what we've spoken again. So Russian student Christian movement was a lay-based, decentralized movement. I put a question mark because we know that there was quite a good organization, with the secretariat and different forms of, kind of bringing these leaders together. So I think we can discuss that. So it was decentralized up to a point. The missionary aim, the basic unit was kruzhok, annual congresses, and also it's important to mention that there was a priest of the movement, the priest Sergei Четверяков, who was a spiritual father of the movement. And I see also parallels between the movement of Zoe in Greece and the Burning Bush in Romania, but these parallels, of course, need to be taken, with, certain critical degree. So there is still need for comparative work. Okay, again, briefly going through the Russian student Christian movement in Estonia, the main kind of target group of the Russian student Christian movement were not just the emigres, who were quite numerous, but also the Russian native population of Pechora region, who were 2/3 of them were peasants, and that's very unique thing, because obviously in Paris there were no Russian peasants, and so this was typical for the Baltic countries, for Latvia and Estonia, where there was a peasant population, and there was a special union to work with these peasants, created and led by Nikolai Penkin. So we estimate that there were between 100 and 150 circles in Tallinn, Narva, Tartu, Valga, Pechora, Kiviõli, But again, it's very difficult to know exactly. The movement was subordinated again. It has to be understood that subordination was very soft, so to say, to the Narva Diocese of the Estonian Apostolic Orthodox Church, and there was quite a good collaboration between the priests in the Narva Diocese and the movement. And legally, it was registered as a voluntary association, so it wasn't a religious organization, but a voluntary association. So we know about Ivan Lagovsky, who started in Paris, but then moved to Estonia in 1933. And because he was married to Tamara Bezhanitskaya. So with now I wanted, because I don't want really to speak for too long, but I just want to draw attention to this conflict that Matthew has already mentioned, the conflict between Eulogy and the Karlovci Synod. I think it's a very interesting case study to discuss the post-Moscow Council understanding of church and sobornost and canonicity, because the documents that deal with this conflict, they actually show us how the Russian church and immigration dealt with these issues of conciliarity that concerned the movement. For example, I found, maybe this is well known, but still I found this letter in the archives of the World Student Christian Association in Yale. And this is a letter translated into English from Lipirovsky to Zinkovsky that explains the conflict between Eulogy and the Bishops' Council of Karlovci that condemned the Russian student Christian movement. What I found interesting here is how Metropolitan Eulogy appeals to the decree, ukaz of Patriarch Tikhon as the basis of his authority, and how he challenges the institutions of the Bishop Synod and Council, who only appear to be Soborny. So he accuses them of claiming to be Soborny, conciliar, while they are not, according to his view, because they lack canonical authorization. And their significance is, as he says, only factual and moral. So here I think it's really interesting to see how this notion of canonicity and conciliarity was applied by the Russian church in immigration. And and another letter is also very interesting, so I'm going very quickly. It really deserves to be discussed at length. But this is a letter from the secretary of the movement, Nikitin, to Vladimir Buchholz, who was the Estonian citizen. He was kind of Russified German, and he was a Protestant, but he was a great friend of the movement, and he basically sponsored it and helped to raise money from the Lutheran organizations in Estonia and other countries. And here in this letter, Nikitin explains to Buchholz how, what was the problem with this, with the hierarchy, with Bishop Antony. So what he says is Bishop Antony gave his blessing to the movement unofficially, and he was very irritated when the movement asked a formal approval from the synod. And he wrote that, why didn't you sit quietly? Why did you just, go to ask official approval? Like nobody was really doing anything wrong to you. So basically he was showing that he couldn't do anything because the movement was attacked. It was regarded as being infiltrated by Freemasons, taking money from YMCA, etc. So, and he personally really wanted to kind of remain friends, but at the same time, he couldn't do anything on the official level. So at the same time, I think we need to keep in mind that the movement wanted a certain freedom and a certain autonomy within the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. It didn't really want to be subordinated, so the conflict between the movement and the hierarchy was mutual. So the movement demanded to have a degree of autonomy, and I think within the Estonian church they have received such autonomy because the Narva diocese had also kind of very weak position within the Estonian Apostolic Church, and therefore I believe the relationship between the hierarchs such as Jan Bulin and the priests in the Narva diocese were much more amiable compared to the relationship, let's say, between Jan Pomers in Latvia and the movement. We know about the conflict, which took place there in such a way that the members of the movement were accused of murdering the bishop, which of course was quite was never proven, and it's been described by Plekhanov in his memoirs how they were arrested and how this case didn't really have any ground. But yes, the rumors had it that the members of the movement might have had something to do with the murder of Bishop Jan. So this is something which I think needs further investigation. I'm just going to move on and just mention again what Cyrille has mentioned about the involvement of lay people, youth, children, women, about activity, really important part women played in the movement. We see these photographs, young women, they like really made the majority of these attendees of the conferences. Conciliar forms and activism, involvement of rank and files members in activities, the role of charity. And also I wanted to emphasize that youth is a very specific group within, not just within the church, generally within society. So it has its own characteristics such as, interest in socialization, energy, non-conformism, humor, they just really loved to have good jokes there in these meetings. So I think this movement required very specific forms of engagement. So you can't expect from young people, to stand, long hours in church, to be ascetic, to be, very pious. So I think these kind of leaders who worked with the movement, they understood how to approach the young people. But at the same time, we need to say that because this is a group that is based on age, it means it's not permanent. So this, these young people, they grow up, they stop being young anymore, and it means that they will be just ordinary members of the church. Some of them become maybe let's say organizers of youth movement. Others will just stop being a member. So this kind of let's say natural fluctuation kind of affected the movement. The movement was kind of going from crisis to crisis. There was constant problems with finances, with relationship with authorities. So we know the story. So it was actually having a difficult time in the mid-30s when let's say in the Baltic, the countries of the Baltic turned to the right. So there was a lot of pressure put on the movement, and then eventually they were closed as organizations. So one last slide I wanted to show. Well, maybe I'll show just some two more slides. Okay, one slide was about how we need to approach this conciliarity issue. I think what is important is to look how the movement called itself. And here we see that Движение movement was not really the only term. if we read the documents and memoirs about the Latvian movement, it never called itself a movement. It actually called itself togetherness, единение. We also hear or see the words содружество, commonwealth. So I think we need to keep this in mind, that movement was not the only category, not the only term used. And here I also want to mention that the members of the movement, they were reflecting on their own structure and they were looking for parallels. I found that, for example, Valentina Zander, so she has written a work, I haven't found it yet, but she's written a study about fraternities in the history of the Western and Eastern Church. So they were looking for parallels, they were looking for precedents. And we also need to consider that the Russian student Christian movement was not the only form of organizing this kind of, what to say, para-ecclesial types of organization. There were different fraternities, and there was Fraternity of Holy Sophia, the Wisdom of God, organized by Father Sergei Bulgakov, and its kind of role, its function is very kind of interesting. So it kind of wanted to be this kind of ideological center for other movements. So we see that there are different experiments, different types, and we need to kind of see the bigger context and try to evaluate these different forms. And also, just last point about ecumenical contacts, we've already discussed YMCA and their influence. We also need to look at the organizations within Europe. For example, as I mentioned, Vladimir Buchgold's, sorry, I need to put G. So he was organizing connections between Baltische, Russland, Arbeiten, who were helping the movement in Estonia and in Latvia, and they were also supporting Christians in Soviet Russia, sending food packages. So this is, again, an interesting connection that needs further exploration, how not only American ecumenical organizations were involved, but also different European Protestant organizations were involved in the activity of the RSCM. So this is my last point, and I would like to stop my slide share. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Irina. And last but not least, report in our first round of our discussion is about the influence of the Russian student Christian movement on the Orthodox thought and on the Orthodox believers, especially in Russia, through such an institution like a journal Vestnik RSCM. And here I would like to give the floor to Barbara Martin, please.
Thank you very much for this introduction. So I'm going to talk about the later periods, and more specifically, as you said, about the context that the movement had with Russian Orthodox believers in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 1980s. So I'm concentrating on the Russian Student Christians Movement's journal, Vestnik RHD, which in the late 60s started reorienting itself. Earlier, it was a publication predominantly for Russian emigre readership in the West, and starting from the late 60s, under the editorship of Nikita Struve, it began to address also a Soviet readership and also to publish articles by Soviet authors. So just a few dates about this collaboration. So the first context that Nikita Struve had in the Soviet Union were with the parish of Father Alexandre Min. And more specifically, a key figure here was Yevgeny Barabanov, who was Alexandre Min's spiritual son. And in September 1970, there's a meeting taking place in Warsaw between Struve and Barabanov. And as far as I know, they seem to have discussed during this meeting this reorientation of the journal towards Russian readership. And this was reflected in 1974 in the change of the title of the journal. The word student was omitted from this title, which became the Вестник Русского Христианского Движения, to reflect this closer connection with Moscow. This was an evolution that had been taking part for the past few years, with a dialogue that began to take place between the new converts, Russian Orthodox converts in Soviet Russia, in the context of religious revival taking place primarily within the intelligentsia. And they stepped into a dialogue with the Russian student Christian movement about new forms of church communities, lay activism, and their role in this religious revival. So in this presentation, I'm going to look at three cases of such experiments of conciliarity in the late Soviet Union that appeared on the pages of the Vestnik in the 1970s, 1980s. So to start with, I'm going to talk about Father Alexandre Min's parish and his experience, his experiment of the small groups, małe grupy. One of the publications, so basically apart from Barabanov, there were a number of parishioners of Father Alexandre Min who were publishing on the pages of the Vestnik in the 1970s and 1980s. And one of them was Sergei Bычkov. And in 1982, he elaborated the Samizdat questionnaire, which he proposed to three parishioners of Father Alexandre Min. These are Yakov Krotov, Andrey Zimirov, and Leonid Vasilenko. And he asked them 7 questions about the Russian Orthodox Church and published their answers. The first publication was by Andrey Zimirov, published anonymously. And then there was a second one with the answers of Yakov Krotov and Leonid Vasilenko, which were published under pseudonyms. So I'm going to concentrate on the first one because I think it raises these important questions of conciliarity. So the authors reflected on the causes of current problems faced by the Russian Orthodox Church and of ways of solving them. So Besmertny concluded that the church faced a crisis that had both external causes and internal ones. And for him, the way out of the crisis was to turn to an active Christianism directed not towards political struggle, but church construction combined with intense spiritual work and mysticism. And this could be done through the creation of small communities of active lay people connected with one or several members of the clergy. These small groups, which in fact had existed in Father Alexandre Min's parish since 1976, would be closely involved in parish life, but also be united by bonds of friendship. So here I quote from the article: "These communities are called upon not to replace church life in the parish, but to duplicate it, because the latter cannot develop freely at the moment. In other words, these small communities are not an alternative to the current church, but this church itself. The clergy, and if possible, the bishops, should be aware of their existence and give them their blessing. And more broadly, he called for an end to the strict delineation between pastors and their passive flock, appealing to the historical precedent of brotherhoods to show that active organization of lay people are quite intrinsic to the Orthodox tradition. And even if they had not been, times have now come when they are necessary. Through this publication, the author presented readers of the Vjesnik AHD with a model of parallel parish structure that had proved its value and could be replicated elsewhere in the USSR, as long as religious life would remain constrained by coercive regulations. The second example I would like to mention is Father Arkady Shatov's brotherhoods. So Sergei Bychkov, whom I mentioned, was also involved in the life of this underground brotherhood, an Orthodox circle which gathered around Arkady Shatov, who is now Bishop Panteleimon. And Bychkov recalled that he created a charter for Shatov's group, which defined itself as a brotherhood, bratstvo, and published it on the pages of the Vjesnik AHD. He also says that the journal itself occupied an important place in the life of their group and became a uniting basis of their brotherhoods. They discussed articles together, and they would send the result of their discussions to Paris, and sometimes it would appear on the pages of the journal. Another person who took place in these meetings, although he was a bit on the side, was future Father Georgy Kochetkov, who had met Shatov in 1978. And Kochetkov had been involved in activities of catechization since the early 1970s. So when Shatov was ordained priest in 1979, he invited Kochetkov to organize catechization groups for new converts of his parish. And Kochetkov himself was an author of the Vjesnik. The first article he published in 1979 was a long essay under the pseudonym Nikolai Gerasimov, which aimed at sharing his experience and reflections with new converts who had recently come to the Orthodox Church. He said that the article was written for Shatov's group to help them figure out church life, because back then they did not understand it well. And he concentrated in this article on the notion of entrance into the church, insisting on the role of human relations and communities in this process, in addition to the main encounter with God. These relations could develop in two directions at once. On the one hand, as a deepening of the relationship to the church as a whole, and on the other in the form of closer bonds with brothers and sisters in Christ within a brotherhood or a sisterhood, or a home church within a family. So here I quote from the article: "In such a group which would not separate itself from existing parishes, but would have its own liturgic practice, each member's spiritual gifts can open up and find use. In it, these gifts find recognition and confirmation among all brothers, members of the community, whose voices can progressively grow and become the church's voice." So Kochetkov himself drew on his the experience of his own community, which was separate from Shatov's, in which he reinvented such traditions as agapes, or inspired by early Christian practices. And these innovations would later become a staple of the Transfiguration Brotherhood, which he founded in 1990. Kochetkov himself was ordained a deacon in 1983 and excluded shortly thereafter from the Leningrad Spiritual Seminary for his connections with Baptists. And he published the same year an article in the Vjesnik calling for a dialogue between the two Christian confessions. And this article, which was quite provocative, raised a response from Father Johann Meyendorff, who was on the journal's editorial board, and he objected in particular to an idea at the end of Kochetkov's article. It was the idea that Christianity in the 20th century should offer two models of church life. One is inspired by the New Testament spirit of grace and freedom, based on small groups of devoted Christians who have already reached a level of spiritual maturity and perfection, and the other being the traditional ecclesial form of church organization inherited from the Old Testament, suited for believers who had yet to reach spiritual maturity. So Father Johann Meyendorff found this idea monstrous and thus offered a response to this article. So to conclude this presentation, I'd like to say that the three models presented in this article show that for new converts of the late Soviet period, this model of small church community or brotherhoods uniting lay people and sometimes with a connection with the priest, beyond and parallel to the parish, was considered as an attractive form that facilitated the integration of new converts into the church in conditions of strict control of parish life under Soviet rule. And it's not coincidental that this dialogue took place on the pages of the Viesnik RHD, of course. I think maybe it's not right to speak directly of an influence of the RSCM on Russian converts, but it's more like a convergence of their visions, especially in terms of their vision of conciliarity. And the journal really allowed for such a dialogue to take place between the immigration and the new Russian Christian movement in the Soviet Union. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Interesting that Kochetkov and Shatov then became ideological opponents. I would like to propose an opportunity to our speakers to add something to the reports of our colleagues, and then to go to the discussion.
I just wanted to ask Barbara to clarify. I didn't quite catch. So Father John Meyendorff was criticizing this article by Father Kochetkov, yes?
Yes, so Kochetkov says that basically it raised an uproar in the immigration, and he assumes that the Viesnik's editorial board had no choice but to answer, and he considers that Father Johann Meyendorff's answer was quite mild. I mean, he criticized some aspects, but was also positive about other aspects of the article. And Kochetkov considers that it was quite wise to act in such a way so as to just calm down the polemics.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Somebody would like to add? If not, let's start our discussion, and I would like to give the room for each our participant to ask the questions. And while you're thinking, I would like to ask maybe Cyrille and Barbara and other, of course, other speakers. Did the movement attempt to reach out to Russian students in post-Soviet Russia?
So personally, I didn't really look at the post-Soviet periods, but I know that I know that there was this book smuggling program to the Soviet Union of the Russian student Christian movement, and it continued into the late Soviet period in new forms, but it took more the forms of charity. But there was also book publishing components to it. But I don't know about context with students and youth specifically. Maybe Cyrille can say more.
Yes, I can say several points concerning this question. The first one is that there was an attempt to create RSCM in the post-Sovietic Russia in the middle or beginning of 90s. And we must say that many of our, some of our members were present in Russia at that time for different reasons, but it was a kind of tradition in our movement to be as much as possible present in Russia, even in Soviet Russia. It happened. So I know that there were some discussions and concrete discussions about the possibility to create a local section of the RSCM in Russia. For some reasons, and I don't know precisely why, it didn't happen. But I think for researchers like you, there are some materials that can be found about those discussions. First of all. Then, of course, there were bilateral contacts and exchanges between Paris and Moscow, and more generally Russia. And until now, I would say that those contacts are more or less, in a more or less formal way. We have contacts, and especially I must say with the Brotherhood of Father George Kochetkov. We have had many different contacts, collaborations, encounters. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much. I saw that Natalia Vasilievich rose her hand virtually.
Yes, I forgot that Cyrille is present here and he can answer better than me. I think that there are still projects which RSHD is doing in Russia or not. That no, but it was recently. There was this in St. Petersburg, this caritative charitable organization Ночлежка, which helped to people who didn't have homeless people. Yeah, so it's closed.
I forgot to say that the one of our departments, the one founded by Kirill Alexandrovich Elcheninov in the early 60s, which was thought at the beginning as a department in order to help and to support Christians, believers and Christians in the Soviet Union, was transformed after the fall of the Soviet Union in a social department. That is to say, the idea was to raise money in the West and to send this money in order to support some different social activities in Russia, and more generally in the post-Sovietic area. So this department did an enormous job, raising a considerable amount of money here and supporting many different projects, not only social but also pedagogical, cultural, and so on. But we had, unfortunately, to close this department 1 year ago, and it was just before the war with Ukraine, the last episode, tragic, and in a way it was prophetic that we decided to close this department before the beginning of this war, because now the contacts are impossible.
Thank you.
Andrey,
Andrey would like to add something, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm without the picture. I'm Andrey Shishkov from Minsk, and I'm glad to see some people here. Paul Valier, Cyrille. I've written an anthropological study of RSCM, so not theological, nor historian, but more an anthropological study, and I discussed precisely this. How did the contacts between this Western European development of the movement and the post-Soviet parts of it go? So, but I've done it. But I would like to add some an important dimension. I think it's important to mention it today because when we discuss it, it's sometimes binary. There are two poles. There is Paris, Moscow, Western Europe, Russia. But I think it's especially important in the history of RSCM that it is not exclusively nationally Russian. It is not a nationalistic movement, it's an ecclesial movement, and many of its intellectual and personal roots are not exactly Russian in the sense of the contemporary Russian Federation. So first of all, many of its founders and founder members, such as Berdiaev, Zinkovsky, and others, Florovsky, they were born in the contemporary Ukraine. They are members of the Kievan tradition, and this is not only about its beginnings, but in the post-Soviet period, the movement and its contacts were also present in Ukraine, as well as Belarus. So, of course, there is a fraternity of Father George Kochetkov, which is very important. But there is, for example, a tradition in Kiev, or Kyiv, the publishing house Duch y Litera, Spirit and Letter, led by such person as Konstantin Sigov. And this was another way of transmitting the heritage of the Russian immigration, the intellectual tradition of Russian immigration in Russian language, but also in Ukrainian. And it's not only about the books or newspapers, it's also about the physical personal contacts. For example, the summer camp Theological Institute under Kiev that was held from the 2004, if I'm not mistaken, till 2020. Basically, the last one was under COVID online, but for more than a decade, there was this space where people from Russia, Western Europe, America, so Paul Valier, who is present here, he was there many times, and Ukraine and Belarus, they all met there. And it was also an ecumenical conference, not only Orthodox, but it was in the Kievan context well, where the heritage of such people as Berdiaev or Zenkovsky is not something historically or geographically remote, it's something close to these people. Well, this is just one example. For example, in Belarus, Father Meyendorf was teaching his lectures in Minsk in the 90s. So this is one of the examples. But I think it's important today to underline and to stress that the Russian student Christian movement is not only about Russian language, and it's not only about Russia as a state that we have today. It's more of a Russian intellectual and ecclesial tradition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrey, for this important addition.
Yeah, if I can continue, because yeah, I didn't finish then. Giving only one input, but then I gave, but it's good because I made a local level in St. Petersburg, Andrey made the regional level, and now I come to global level because Russian Student Christian Movement was one of the founding members of Syndesmos, of World Fellowship of Orthodox Youth. That's how I knew Cyrille, for example, and I knew the tradition of the movement. And the movement influenced a lot the whole, let's say, agenda of Orthodoxy through this global movement, and also transmitted to people who participated in Syndesmos events a lot of ideas and legacy from the movement and from the founding fathers of the movement. And I think it was very important also for our region and globally that this link was done in this framework for youth. It was not university students, it was not established in groups in the universities like in the beginning of 20th century, but it was informal contacts and informal lectures like summer camps or festivals or things like that, which were this fora for this communication. And I would say from my own experience in end of 90s, in the 2000s, in the beginning of 2000s, it was very, very strong and present and visible as one of the leading forces, I would say, of the whole World Orthodox Youth movement.
Thank you. Any questions? More? Okay. I would like to ask about decision-making process and about conciliarity, because our seminar series is about soborность and conciliarity. And during our seminars, we discussed sometimes. Last one was when last autumn, when Dan Scarborough told about the Moscow Council of 1917. In the process of decision-making inside the Russian student Christian movement, is it democracy or something else? Or something, how to say, democracy with this, what is this church or ecclesial component of conciliarity which distinguish it from the democratic institution?
It's a question for me, I guess.
Yes, for the president, Mr. President.
So I would answer, it depends. It depends. Of course, we try to be more than democracy. I mean, conciliarity is behind democracy, but to reach conciliarity is very difficult for many different reasons. It's very time consuming, very time consuming. It requires a willing of all the people present to agree with the principle of conciliarity and to play the game, I would say. And this is not always the case. And if you read the Zenkovsky's memory, it is very well written. And this and when I read this, I really feel I mean, I have the same experience that some people I don't know, I don't remember, but he speaks about psychology of conciliarity, and according to him, some people absolutely don't have this psychological component of conciliarity.
Could you explain what is the essence of this component? What is it? Unanimity or a consensus principle or something else?
Again, read what Zenkovsky wrote about this. Mm-hmm. He explained that when a decision is really conciliar, it is not the opinion of one group against another group. It is when something new appears, which belonging to neither to the first group nor to the second one. Okay, if one group has the position A and the second position B, the result of the conciliar process, and this is a long process, when we listen to each other, try to understand the position. The group A tries to understand the position of the group B, and very often there are not only two groups but 3 or 4, and the result is group C. I mean something that is neither A nor B, nor A plus B, nor the average of A and B, but something totally new on which everybody agrees. I don't know if I am clear, but
yes, that's clear, and it is very much corresponds what we heard from Daniel Skarsborough, who described these pre-assemblies in 1917, the same principle of sobornost, conciliarity, when priests voted for something to reach this some kind of synthesis of consensus between different groups. Yes, thank you.
Because the idea is not only sorry, Ulyana, I will give you the floor. Just to finish, the idea is not only to listen to the position of the others, but to leave a free space for God's involvement. You see the point. So it is not so to listen to God's will in a way. Okay, and that's why you may imagine that's actually is very time consuming, and usually we launch this kind of process when we have a big crisis and we don't know how to act and to react. I must say that I experienced this very few times, very few. But when I experienced it, I really understood that this was a conciliar process. Ulyana?
You have said my thought about it, because Zenkovsky wrote that in there was a very important to make discussions in the high of spiritual life, in spiritual thoughts about the such or another question. To make a decision in the spiritual line.
Yes, and interesting. Did they and did you use some special spaces like liturgical space to reach such a consensus? For example, to attend the liturgy and then to discuss and reach the consensus, or no?
I would say that we don't have any methodology, and this is our weak point. You remember, Andrey and Irina, you were both present at this conference in Rome, beginning of November of last year, about conciliarity, listening to the East. And we understood that the strength of the West is to try to formalize and elaborate a kind of methodology, which is absolutely not our case and not in our way of acting and behaving. So we don't have any methodology, but of course I would say that this is linked somehow with prayer, either community or individual as well.
Yes, thank you. That is a space for creative work of theologians and liturgical practitioners. Any questions more? I think we already discussed the topic more than an hour and a half, and it was yes.
I could just maybe continue to add what has been discussed about the structure and the processes, because I don't still understand the connection between the governance structures of the movement and the these kruzhki. So I really didn't see, maybe I haven't yet found, but I haven't seen like how would the members of this kruzhki be involved in this conciliar process, like where they would be somehow electing their representatives to participate in this decision-making process, because from what I understand is that kruzhki were working, gathering, and quite a free sort of style. There was no really any formalized way how they should be working. And then the leaders of this kruzhki and some members, they would go to the conferences, and the conference, one annual conference, and also local conferences that took place in different times. So they were discussing spiritual issues, the different topics, but I couldn't see how they say something about the movement as a kind of ecclesial or with a fraternal structure. Do you see what I mean? So I think this dimension was to me not really clear. So the secretariat and the various people who were organizers, so they had their own responsibilities, correspondence, and conflicts, and all this, relationship with the hierarchy. But yeah, So that's what I think we know, but I don't see the connection between rank and file members and the leadership. If you could say that like there was some sort of form of, but maybe.
Actually, the way it functions has changed throughout the history. In the beginning, in order to be member of the RSCM, you were obliged to be member of a circle. Okay, but I would say 20 years after the foundation, so in the end of 30s, I think it wasn't the case anymore, because initially circles were thought for students. So people who went through those circles 20 years later were not students anymore, but still they wanted to take part in the life of the movement and to stay member of the movement. So the system changed, and you were not obliged to be member of a circle in order to enter the movement. And in the beginning of the history of the movement, conferences were the most important instance of the structure of the movement. Now this is not conference anymore, but more a general assembly, quite similarly to all the associations of in our country, in France. So it's difficult to see and to understand how does it work, how did it work, and how does it work now, because the place of the circles was very, very strong in the beginning. It is less the case now.
Okay, yeah, I understand.
You see the global picture.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. So I think this is only the one of first gatherings about RSCM, and there will be more this year because it's going to be a jubilee. But as Andrey Shishkov has emphasized, it's like we should really see it in a kind of less kind of Russocentric way, because the significance of the movement was much broader, and it's not just about Russian nationality. So I think there is quite a lot there to to think about the kind of implications of this movement. But I don't really want to make any conclusion. I think this was really good discussion. I really learned a lot and I enjoyed it. So if maybe, Andrey, you want to have the last word as our discussant and moderator.
The last word is your prerogative.
Okay, good.
As the project leader.
Where's the last word? Yes, well, I think the last word should be that there is still quite a lot to reflect on. So I hope we will continue this conversation in other forums, in other venues, hopefully, and I also yes, I hope that there will be a revival of these lay-based movements in the Orthodox Church, in general, whether they're youth-based or not youth-based, but I feel that this kind of spirit and energy are very much lacking in today's Orthodox churches, and this is just our modest contribution to this revival as scholars to try to kind of bring into public domain knowledge and understanding of this unique, amazing, and very, very important movement. If you think about the figures in Orthodoxy in the 20th century, like Metropolitan Antony of Surosh and many others, well, Father Sergei Bulgakov, Mother Maria Skoptsova. So all these figures were connected with this movement, and I think they have played the role in the revival in the 90s, and I hope they will continue inspire people. So this is my last word, and thank you so much for everybody to turn up and to be here. Matthew, yeah, I hope you don't regret joining us in all these conversations. And Ulyana, I think it's the first time we meet, and Barbara and Cyrille, so thanks.